and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. You're watching Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. This Saturday, September 4th, Chileans will vote on a new constitution. Chile's constitutional process to build a more inclusive, participatory, and responsive democratic system is being closely watched around the world. The repercussions of Chile's constitutional process and the results of this referendum will likely extend far past its borders. Joining me on this show today to help me better understand what is at stake, we have Peter Ciavelis. He is a professor of political science and international affairs at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He has published widely on Latin American and Chilean politics, including a recent analysis in the Foreign Policy magazine titled How Chile's Constitutional Overhaul Has Emboldened the Right. Peter, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. You know, Malaysia and Chile may be miles apart, but we, along with the rest of the world, are watching with great interest Chile's experiment in participatory democracy and rewriting its constitution for the 21st century. I'm wondering whether you can begin our conversation tonight by helping us understand the dissatisfaction with the current constitution, the 1980s dictatorship era constitution, and why Chile wants to write a new charter.
Great, Melissa. First of all, it's lovely to be here with you. I'm so happy. It's a real honor to be able to speak with you and your viewers. Sure, I can start out by just talking a little bit about what is wrong with the 1980 Constitution. I think in general, there's a number of faults that the Chilean population has pointed to, but the principal one is the legitimacy of its origin. The 1980 Constitution was literally written by just a dozen people and then really imposed on the Chilean population. And in my previous work, I refer to the Chilean Constitution, the 1980 Constitution that governs Chile today, as something of a straitjacket. There were so many impediments to reforming the Constitution that it was quite difficult. And so as Chile entered its democratic transition in the 1990s, it was governed by essentially an authoritarian document that put strong limits on popular representation, strong limits on reform, strong limits on the representation of parties. And so in this sense, the legitimacy of its origin has come into question as when Chile exploded into protest and demanded a new constitution. Also, in terms of its content, the Constitution really firmly enshrines the sort of neoliberal economic model that was inherited from the Pinochet dictatorship. And so in this sense, during the years of the transition and after, these sorts of guarantees, these sort of market guarantees in the privatization of the pension system, the retirement, the health system, the education system, really produced a level of inequality that is sort of unprecedented in the world. Inequality in a region characterized by inequality. So in this sense, the demands that came out of the 2019 protests were to fundamentally rewrite the Constitution in order to establish a legitimate democratic document, and at the same time, guarantee or provide a framework at the very least for the reform of these Pinochet-era social policies. So in a nutshell, that's really what the content of the demands are for those who were demanding a new constitution.
Okay. So before we get into the draft of this new constitution, I do want to talk about the way it was drafted. So, so much attention has been put on the constitutional process because it's unprecedented for it to have all these participatory mechanisms. And when Malaysia is looking at the process, we often cite the participatory democracy aspect of it, because here in Malaysia we think, oh, maybe some of our social injustices, social inequalities can also be resolved through participatory democracy. Talk to me about the putting together this body of members who would then draft what would be a constitution for the entire country.
Yeah, I mean, really, to just sort of reiterate what you said, Melissa, this is really an unprecedented process. First, it's very rare that a country would draft a constitution in times of peace. It's unprecedented. I can't think of a single example of this happening where a constitution was actually promulgated in the end. In Iceland, there was a similar process, but the constitution was never put into effect. So in this sense, the fact that a constitution is being written in times of peace and not following a dictatorship, not following a war, is really unprecedented, and that's why the world's eyes are on this process. Second, this is a constitution that came out of a social movement, which is also unprecedented in the world, that a social movement can actually produce the rewriting of a constitution. And finally, the fact that this is a parity constitution, one written by half women and half men, is unprecedented in the world, and also with the representation of indigenous minorities. So in this sense, Chile really is a trailblazer in all sorts of different ways. Now, the Chileans sent a clear message in the first plebiscite a couple of years ago when they went to the polls with a two-question referendum. The first was, do you want a new constitution? And the second was, if so, should that constitution be drafted by the Congress or should it be drafted by a representative body of everyday Chileans? Overwhelmingly, 79% of the population said they wanted a new constitution. And I think about 78% said they wanted it drafted by this citizen body. So elections were held after that to elect 155 members of the Constituent Assembly, half women, half men, 26 of which were representatives of Chile's First Nations. And so in this sense, it's an incredibly representative body. And that has upsides and downsides because in some sense, I think the Constitution, the draft document, which I'm sure we'll talk about, represents really the desires of the Chilean population. But on the other hand, the lack of expertise in the Constituent Assembly also produced a document that has complicated its ultimate approval on Saturday, which has made it uncertain. So in this sense, it's sort of elitist, but a representative system is excellent, but at the same time, some of the expertise, some of the political experience of the members of the Constitutional Convention produced a document that might make its approval a bit more difficult.
Right. So we have the draft. It was released July 4th, and from what I understand, it's really long compared to most other constitutions around the world. 388 articles, 178 pages long. What is in this constitution? I mean, I don't expect you to cover all 78 pages of it, but what would you say stands out to you when you're talking about the constitution? Often when you looking at this, what was the first few things that stood out to you that really took your attention?
Yeah, really departing from the Chilean constitutional tradition, which is extraordinarily legalistic, often difficult to read, often filled with legal language that only sort of an attorney could understand. The document starts out just enumerating a whole series of rights that the Chilean population has. First of all, establishing Chile as a plurinational state. Second, a state that would be characterized by gender equity from the top to the bottom. Rights for indigenous populations, a right of access to technology, the right to clean air, the right to clean water. In essence, enumerating a whole series of fundamental rights that were absent from the previous constitution. And this has also been part of what has complicated and what the opposition has seized upon to try and get a rejection of the draft. Because often it's really hard to say, what does it mean when someone has a right to clean air? What does the state have to do to ensure that? What sort of action needs to be taken? And so some of these vagaries in the establishment of these broad rights have been the subject of objection to the opposition to the population. Also, if we look at the way the Constitution has been discussed, mainly in the international press, especially in the United States, because in the US, there's this sort of image of, these radical Latin American constitution makers in the tradition of Evo Morales in Bolivia and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. This document has nothing of that sort. If you look at the actual elements of the Constitution aimed at the executive branch, the power of the legislative branch. It's really quite within the norm of Latin American constitutions. The length, I think, and the unprecedented length, you're correct, I think it's displaced the Brazilian constitution as the longest in Latin America. Its length is mainly dedicated to the enumeration of these numerous rights which were absent in the previous document and really absent from Chilean constitutional tradition.
Right. Okay, and we're going to take a quick break here, Peter, but I do want to come back and touch on something you brought up, which is the reaction to this draft constitution, both domestically and on the international arena. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris and I'm speaking tonight to Peter Ciavelis. He is a professor of political science and international affairs at Wake Forest University in the US. We're discussing how Chile is facing a key referendum on Saturday, September 4th, to define whether a new and progressive but contentious constitution will replace the existing one. Peter, touching on what you said a little bit just before the break, you talked a little bit about the reaction to the draft constitution. And I wanted to ask you about some of the international press, the coverage or the narrative by the international press. We saw The Economist, its editorial board, calling this draft constitution, quote, fiscally irresponsible left-wing wish list. We had the Wall Street Journal labeling it a suicide mission. It seems like campaigns against the new constitution is in full swing in the international press. How should we in Malaysia and for the rest of the world read this or understand how this is being portrayed, or the narrative of the new constitution in the international arena?
I would say, and what I would suggest to the editorial board of The Economist and the Wall Street Journal, is actually read the document, which I'm not quite sure they've done, because a careful read of the document will show that, yes, indeed, it does guarantee a whole wish list of rights. But at the same time, there's guarantees of fiscal responsibility embedded in the Constitution. In this sense, I don't see it as the same sort of, I think they're portraying it as the same sort of, as I mentioned before, sort of Chavista constitution. That said, I am concerned about the vagaries of it. I think in this sense, the opposition does have some real claim to demand some sort of reform as the process works forward, to establish some clarity on how these basic rights are going to be guaranteed, to more firmly establish the idea that they have to be undertaken in a fiscally responsible way. And much of the commentary that I've done on the Chilean Constitution, what I've wanted to stress fundamentally is this Constitution is walking a fine line, because what constitutions are supposed to be are frameworks for government and frameworks for guaranteeing the rights of minorities and the rights of majorities in this sense. Constitutions are not piñatas. They're not, they don't have something for everybody. They're not supposed to provide goodies. What they're supposed to do is provide a framework in which legislators and parliament can legislate the rights that are enumerated in the Constitution with more detail. So it's fine for me, for example, for the Constitution or for any constitution to say that healthcare is a fundamental human right. But it's not okay for a constitution to say healthcare will be provided by the state. That's policy. That's not a fundamental guarantee. The problem with the Constitution is that it does state that the Chilean state has a responsibility to guarantee the health of the Chilean population. So in this sense, that leaves unclear whether this is going to be healthcare provided by the states, whether there'll be room for private providers. And I think we can say the same thing about every aspect of social provision, from education to retirement to healthcare.
Peter, these vagaries that you point to in the referendum, is it a take it or leave it situation? What would the question be? Will Chileans have to accept the 178 pages of the Constitution as is, or is there space for recalibration down the line?
Well, this is where theory and practice might differ. In theory, this Constitution is a take it or leave it proposition. And it almost has to be. I mean, for these constitutional processes, it's almost as if one were to start a game and then change the rules in the middle of the game. That just is simply not something that's acceptable or legitimate. So in this sense, it is a take it or leave it proposition in theory. But in practice already, up until President Boric, there's been talk of reform and guarantees of reform if the document is approved. So in this sense, this idea and the Socialist Party and the previous Party for Democracy have publicly stated and come to agreement that certain reforms will be made, for example, to the judicial system, that certain guarantees for healthcare, for social provision will be clarified if in the case of approval. So a public agreement that there will be reform to the document after it is approved. And I think fundamentally, strategically, this is a smart move in some ways because it can give some comfort to people in voting for the approve. But in another way, they're essentially admitting that there's problems with the document. So in this sense, it's a sort of a mixed bag with respect to the strategy behind trying to prompt Chilean voters to approve the document on Saturday.
And you, if I understand correctly, you split your time between the US and Chile. What's your sense of the sentiment of the public? Are people excited about voting in this referendum? Are they excited about the draft? Have many of them read the, the draft constitution, or are they relying on campaigns for and against to make the arguments?
Yes, it's very interesting to gauge the mood of Chileans, and the mood has changed. At the beginning, there was enormous optimism. And that optimism for approving the Constitution was approximately at the level of President Boric's approval rating, interestingly. And as his approval rating declined, almost in concert, the support for approving the Constitution dropped. So in some sense, I think this is a little bit of, well, not a little bit, largely a referendum on President Boric in dissatisfaction with the way things are. And I find it seems that the Chileans are enormously fickle because this happened so quickly, the decline for support in the apruebo and for President Boric. But I also think part of this was driven by the process itself. First of all, as the convention was seated, one could characterize it as sort of a circus. I hate to do that, but I mean, it really was, because this was what some analysts refer to as democracy in real time. I mean, people could watch everything the Constitutional Convention was debating. And so even issues that were debated that were absurd, like changing the flag or changing the national anthem, those were presented and debated and rejected, heartily rejected. But the press still said, oh, they're debating changing the flag. They're debating changing the... Well, no, those ideas were never really taken seriously, but they were aired publicly in a process that was enormously transparent. So in this sense, the process itself sort of undermined it. At the same time, what I discussed in the foreign policy piece that you mentioned, there was a concerted campaign, and is a concerted campaign, on the part of the right to promote what could only be characterized as, I'm sorry, fake news about what the Constitution does and doesn't do. Rumors that if an indigenous Mapuche person commits a crime, that he or she would not be subject to Chilean law. That's simply false. There's a number of rumors sort of flying about that have said that this Constitution will do things that it fundamentally does not. And finally, I think the drop in support for it comes for something I really watch in despair. is the lack of coordination of the Apruebo campaign. There's 3 separate campaigns. There's no unity. Messaging is all over the place. And as a 30-year observer of Chilean politics, I compare it to the 1988 Constitution, the 1888 plebiscite to do away with the Pinochet dictatorship, a yes-no vote in October of 1988, where there was coordination among the no forces, a single message that was put out to the Chilean public, unity in support of displacing and ending the Pinochet dictatorship. I don't see that happening right now. And another parallel that's concerning is the slogan of the 1988 plebiscite was La alegría ya viene, happiness is coming. And very quickly people saw with the 1980 Constitution that that happiness was never coming, but there was tremendous optimism. There was tremendous optimism that this process was going to, that this plebiscite was going to change everything, that was going to transform Chilean political life and politics. Among the approval voters in Chile, I see, again, some of that optimism, which in one sense is a good thing. But in another sense, all the problems that Chile faces are not going to be resolved by this new constitution.
Okay. What happens after September 4th, regardless of which way the referendum goes? So if it is, if we do find that Chileans accept this draft constitution, what happens then? And what happens if it's rejected?
Well, I'm also troubled. I'm troubled and a bit worried about the future in Chile. I'll say at the outset, before I talk about possible scenarios, that one way or another, Chile is going to have a new constitution. It's untenable that the 1980 constitution remains in force. But there's a few things that could happen. I'm concerned that with the reject, if the reject campaign wins, that this may unleash a process of political violence of the type that we saw in October of 2019, which I don't think is good for Chile. And that will really sort of split the country, I think, into 2 camps and make it difficult to negotiate a consensus constitution after that, which will come. In the case of the victory of the apruebo, of the approve, I think the narrowness of that margin is also going to undermine the legitimacy of the Constitution, and people will remain with claims that this is an illegitimate Constitution, even though voting is obligatory. I mean, 100% of the population has to vote. But still, with skilled political leadership on President Boric's part and working with other parties, it's possible to negotiate more of a consensus document. That is to say, yes, we realize that this approval was narrow. Yes, we realize that brings into question the legitimacy of the document. And yes, we need to move forward to make some changes to it in order to establish it as a legitimate roadmap to guide Chile's future.
Right. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining me on the show today and for helping us better understand this issue. Appreciate your time. That was Peter Ciavelis, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Wake Forest University. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.